What if the candy your children collect tonight was never meant for them at all, but for something far more ancient, far more hungry, waiting just beyond the veil of our world? The air grows cold as October fades. Leaves crunch beneath your feet, carrying the scent of decay and earth. You carve a pumpkin, light a candle, put on a costume. It feels innocent, doesn't it? A night of treats and laughter. But beneath the surface of jack-o'-lanterns and trick-or-treating lies something that would make your ancestors shudder. Something that was never about candy or children's games. It was about survival. 2,000 years ago, when the Roman Empire was still carving its name across continents, there existed a people in the windswept hills of what we now call Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. The Celts. They were farmers. Warriors, mystics who lived by the rhythm of seasons and the wisdom of stars. But more than anything, they were afraid. Not of wolves or invading armies, but of something that happened once a year when autumn died and winter was born. They called it Samhain, pronounced Soen, and it was the night when the boundaries between the living and the dead dissolved like morning mist. Imagine standing on a hillside in ancient Ireland. The year is slipping away. The harvest is gathered, the animals brought in from distant pastures. The sun sets earlier each day, and darkness claims more of your world. The Celts believed that on the night of October 31st, the membrane separating our realm from the other world grew so thin it could tear. And through those tears, things came through, the spirits of the dead. Not the peaceful, sleeping dead of graveyards, but the restless, the angry, the hungry dead who remembered what it felt like to taste food, to feel warmth, to exist in flesh. The Druids, the Celtic priests who served as judges, healers, and keepers of sacred knowledge, understood what most have forgotten. Death was not an ending but a doorway. The spirits who crossed back on Samhain night were searching. Some sought their old homes, their former families. Others wandered lost and confused, unable to accept their fate. And some, the darkest ones, came back with malicious intent. They could possess the living, steal souls, curse crops, or bring sickness to entire villages. The Celts knew these weren't friendly ghosts hoping for a brief hello. These were powerful, potentially dangerous entities that needed to be acknowledged, respected, and most importantly, appeased. This is where the feeding began. Not with candy bars and chocolate, but with food offerings placed at doorsteps and crossroads. The living would prepare elaborate feasts, but not everyone at the table was breathing. Places were set for deceased family members. Their favorite meals were cooked and served. Portions of the harvest, the best portions, were left outside homes as offerings. Milk, honey, freshly baked bread, cuts of meat. This wasn't generosity. It was survival insurance. Feed the dead well, and perhaps they would move on peacefully. Perhaps they would protect your family rather than harm it. Ignore them, and face consequences that no amount of prayer could undo. The Celts dressed in costumes too, but their purpose was darker than play acting. They wore animal skins and grotesque masks, smeared their faces with ash and mud. Why? To blend in. If the spirits couldn't distinguish between the living and the dead, they might pass you by. Or if a malevolent entity did notice you, it might mistake you for something equally frightening and leave you alone. People moved through the darkness in groups, never alone, carrying torches made from bundled straw. But flames weren't just for light. Fire was believed to have purifying properties, capable of warding off evil spirits or at least keeping them at a distance. At the center of Celtic villages, massive bonfires blazed through the night. The Druids constructed these sacred fires on hilltops, feeding them with oak and ash wood until they roared high enough to be seen for miles. Families would extinguish every fire in their homes and travel to the communal bonfire, where Druids performed rituals, chanted prayers, and made offerings to the gods. Animals were sacrificed, their bones thrown into the flames, giving us the word bonfire from bone fire. The Celts would light torches from the sacred fire and carry the blessed flames home to relight their hearths, believing this would protect their households through the dark winter months ahead. But the offerings to the dead didn't stop at food. The Celts left gifts at fairy mounds and burial sites. They poured libations of ale and mead onto the earth. They spoke to the spirits by name, acknowledging their existence, pleading for mercy or guidance. Some rituals required silence, others required specific incantations passed down through generations. Make a mistake, forget the proper words, and the spirits might take offense. The consequences could be immediate or slow burning, manifesting as unexplained illnesses, crop failures, or terrible accidents throughout the coming year. Children, particularly, were kept close and protected during Samhain. The Celts believed that the young, with their innocent souls and thin connection to the spiritual world, were most vulnerable to possession or being stolen away by entities from the other world. Mothers would draw protective symbols on doorframes using ash or salt. They would tie red thread around their children's wrists, dress them in inside-out clothing to confuse any spirits that might try to claim them. The concept of children wandering door to door collecting treats would have horrified ancient Celts. The night was far too dangerous for such carelessness. As Christianity spread across Celtic lands, the Church couldn't erase Samhain, so they absorbed it instead. November 1st became All Saints' Day, a time to honor Christian martyrs and saints. The night before became All Hallows' Eve, eventually shortened to Halloween. But the old customs persisted, hidden beneath new names and revised meanings. The feeding of the dead transformed into souling, where poor people would go door to door offering prayers for the dead in exchange for soul cakes. The costumes remained, but now they represented saints and angels, rather than disguises from malevolent spirits. The bonfires continued, blessed by priests rather than druids, but lit for the same ancient purpose of protection and purification. What the modern world remembers as innocent tradition was born from genuine terror. Our ancestors didn't celebrate Halloween. They endured it. They survived it. And they made offerings not out of generosity, but out of desperate hope that what lay beyond death would show them mercy for one more year. Tonight, as you hand candy to children in costumes, as you carve faces into pumpkins and light candles inside them, you're participating in an echo of something far older and stranger than you might imagine. The commercial holiday we know today is merely the shadow of Samhain, stripped of its power and danger, packaged into something safe and profitable. But the original purpose hasn't entirely vanished. Every October 31st, without knowing why, we still set out offerings. We still disguise ourselves. We still light fires against the darkness. Deep in our collective memory, something remembers what this night really means. And if you listen closely, if you step outside when the streets grow quiet and the last trick-or-treater has gone home, you might feel it, that subtle change in the air, that sense of being watched by something that doesn't quite belong to this world. The ancient Celts knew this feeling well. They understood that some nights the dead don't stay buried. Some nights they walk among us, searching for something they've lost. And the question that haunted our ancestors remains unanswered even now, waiting in the darkness between streetlights, hidden behind the masks we wear, lingering in the offerings we leave without understanding why. The question is simple but terrifying. What happens when the dead aren't satisfied with what we've given them? The answer came swift and merciless in the winter of 734 AD. In a small village on the western coast of Ireland, whose name has been lost to time, but whose fate was recorded by a traveling monk. The previous Samhain, the village had grown complacent. The harvest had been abundant, their livestock healthy, their children thriving. Perhaps they believed themselves blessed, protected beyond the reach of the old superstitions. They lit their bonfire, yes, but smaller than tradition demanded. They left offerings, but meager ones, the scraps rather than the best portions. They laughed as they dressed in their costumes, treating it as entertainment rather than sacred protection. And when Samhain night passed without incident, they congratulated themselves on their wisdom. The old fears, they decided, were nothing but stories told to frighten children. By midwinter, the sickness came. It started with the livestock, cattle collapsing in fields, their eyes rolled back and foam gathering at their mouths. Then the children began falling ill with fevers that no healer could break. The monk wrote that the afflicted would wake screaming in the night, claiming that cold hands were pulling at them, trying to drag them somewhere dark and deep. 3 children died within a week, 7 more before the snow melted. The village elder, the one who had first suggested reducing the Samhain offerings, was found dead in his bed with his eyes wide open and his face twisted in an expression of absolute terror, though his body showed no signs of violence or disease. The survivors abandoned the village before spring fully arrived. They understood what their ancestors had tried to teach them: the dead do not forgive, and they never, ever forget. This wasn't an isolated incident. Celtic oral traditions are filled with cautionary tales about communities that failed to honor Samhain properly. In one legend from the Scottish Highlands, a wealthy landowner refused to leave offerings for the dead, declaring that he owed nothing to those who no longer worked his fields. On Samhain night, his entire household fell into a trance-like sleep from which they couldn't be woken. When they finally opened their eyes 3 days later, they had all aged decades in appearance. Their hair turned white, their skin wrinkled and thin as parchment. They lived only a few more years, speaking rarely, and when they did speak, they would only say they had been taken somewhere they could never describe, made to see things no living person should witness. The Druids taught that the dead weren't merely spirits floating in some ethereal realm. They existed in the other world, a parallel dimension that mirrored our own, but operated under different rules, different physics. Time moved strangely there, sometimes faster, sometimes slower. The geography shifted according to emotion and memory rather than fixed physical laws. And the beings who dwelled there, both the recently deceased and the ancient ones who had crossed over centuries ago, possessed powers that the living could barely comprehend. They could manipulate dreams, influence thoughts, manifest physical phenomena. The barrier between worlds existed for a reason, the Druids explained, to protect both sides from each other. But Samhain was the night when that protection weakened, when contact became not just possible, but inevitable. The offerings weren't bribes. They were acknowledgments. A recognition that death was not an end but a transformation, that those who had passed still maintained connections to the world they left behind, and that respect flowed both ways across the veil. The food left at doorsteps served multiple purposes. For benevolent spirits, particularly deceased family members, it was a gesture of love and remembrance, sustaining them in whatever form they now held. For neutral spirits, those simply passing through on their journey to wherever souls ultimately go, it was hospitality, a way of ensuring safe passage without interference. But for the malevolent dead, those who harbored resentment or rage or simply refused to accept their fate, the offerings were appeasement. A tribute that said, "We acknowledge your power, we respect your claim on this night. Please move past us without harm." The jack-o'-lantern itself descends from this practice, though its origin story is darker than most realize. The Celts carved turnips and gourds, hollowing them out and placing embers or candles inside. These weren't decorations. They were markers, beacons that served 2 purposes. For friendly spirits, they were lights guiding them home, showing them that their families remembered them and welcomed their brief return. For hostile entities, they were warnings that this household was protected, watched over by the light that spirits feared. The grotesque faces carved into these vegetables weren't meant to look frightening to the living, but to appear as fellow spirits to the dead, as if the house itself had guardians that wouldn't tolerate interference. The name Jack-o'-lantern comes from an Irish legend about a man called Stingy Jack, a blacksmith and notorious trickster who managed to trap the devil himself multiple times through clever bargains and supernatural manipulation. When Jack eventually died, heaven rejected him for his wickedness, but hell wouldn't take him either because the devil, still angry about being tricked, refused him entry. Jack was condemned to wander the earth eternally, caught between worlds, neither fully alive nor properly dead. The devil, perhaps taking some pity, tossed Jack a burning ember from hell to light his way through the darkness. Jack carved out a turnip and placed the ember inside, creating a lantern to guide his endless wandering. The Irish began carving turnips with grotesque faces, placing them in windows and doorways on Samhain night, symbolizing Stingy Jack and warning other lost spirits away from their homes. When Irish immigrants brought this tradition to America, they discovered pumpkins were larger and easier to carve than turnips, and the modern jack-o'-lantern was born. But there were other protections beyond offerings and carved lanterns. The Celts built elaborate defense systems against the spirit world, passed down through generations with the same seriousness as lessons about hunting or farming. Salt, harvested from the sea, was scattered across thresholds because spirits couldn't cross lines of salt. Iron, forged from the earth, was hung above doorways because the dead feared the metal that could hold physical form. Hawthorn trees, sacred to the Celts, were never cut down because they served as barriers between worlds, their branches creating natural protective boundaries that spirits respected. Rowan wood, carved with protective symbols, was carried as talismans. Even the act of walking, something so simple we never questioned it, had rules on Samhain night. Always move clockwise around buildings. Never respond to voices calling from the darkness unless you're absolutely certain of the speaker's identity. Never look directly behind you after sunset. These weren't superstitions. To the Celts, these were survival protocols refined over centuries of experience. The most powerful protection, however, came from community. The Celts understood that isolation was vulnerability. On Samhain night, families gathered together in the largest home, piling close around the fire, maintaining constant conversation and song to keep the darkness at bay. The Druids would move between houses, blessing each threshold, speaking words of power that had been taught to them by their predecessors going back countless generations. Village men would form patrols, walking the perimeter with torches and weapons, not to fight physical threats, but to maintain a human presence, to show the spirits that the living claimed this space and would defend it. Women would weave protective charms from wheat stalks and red thread, hanging them from rafters and door frames. Children were taught specific prayers to recite if they felt a presence nearby, words that essentially said, "I see you, I acknowledge you, but I am protected, and you must pass on." And yet, despite all these precautions, despite centuries of accumulated wisdom and protective practices, people still vanished on Samhain night. Not every year, not in every village, but regularly enough that everyone knew someone who had lost a person to the darkness. Sometimes they would return days later with no memory of where they'd been, speaking in languages they'd never learned, or possessing knowledge they couldn't have acquired. Sometimes they never returned at all. The Druids explained these disappearances as the tithe, the price that had to be paid to maintain the balance between worlds. The other world demanded its due, and occasionally that due was measured in human souls rather than food offerings and animal sacrifices. There's a particular account from Wales, documented by a Christian scribe who was simultaneously horrified and fascinated by what he witnessed. A young woman, recently married, went missing on Samhain night in the year 891. Her husband and father searched for days, following tracks that led to a fairy mound, an ancient burial site the Celts believed served as a doorway to the otherworld. 7 years later, to the day, she reappeared exactly where she had vanished. She hadn't aged a single hour. To her, only a single night had passed. She spoke of being taken to a feast in a great hall underground, of being unable to resist the music and dancing, of losing all sense of time while she celebrated with beautiful people who never seemed to tire or age. When her family told her 7 years had passed, that her husband had remarried and her parents had grown old, she collapsed. Within 3 days, she aged all 7 years simultaneously, her body withering as if trying to catch up with time it had lost. She died speaking about the feast, how the food glowed with its own light, how the music still echoed in her mind, how part of her remained there still, dancing forever in that underground hall. The Celts called this phenomenon being taken by the fair folk, though whether the fair folk and the dead were the same thing or different categories of spirit remained debated among Druids. What they agreed upon was that Samhain was when both became most active, most dangerous, most likely to interact with the living in ways that could never be undone. And the question that haunted them, the question that still echoes through every Halloween celebration we hold today, wasn't just about what happened when offerings weren't enough. It was far more personal, far more terrifying. The question was this: what if someone you loved, someone who died, came back on Samhain night not to visit, but to claim you, to pull you across that barrier into the darkness with them, because death is lonely, and the dead miss the living more than we could ever imagine missing them? That question had a name in Celtic society. They called it grief calling, and it was considered the most dangerous phenomenon of Samhain night. Not all spirits who returned were strangers or ancient entities from forgotten times. Sometimes they were mothers who died in childbirth, fathers killed in battle, children taken by disease. And their love, twisted by death and separation, could become something unrecognizable, something possessive, something that would rather drag the living into darkness than remain apart. There's a recorded case from Brittany, documented by a monk named Brother Cadfael in his private journal, never meant for church eyes. A widow named Morwenna lost her husband to a hunting accident 3 months before Samhain. They had been married 20 years, childhood sweethearts who grew old together, and his death shattered her completely. She refused to eat, refused to leave their home, spoke to his empty chair as if he still sat in it. Her children begged her to stay with them on Samhain night to come to the communal gathering where the Druids could protect her, but she refused. She wanted to be home, she said, in case he found his way back to her. Her children reluctantly left her there, promising to return at first light. They found her the next morning standing in the center of their cottage, still as a statue, her eyes fixed on something no one else could see. She was smiling, Brother Cadfael wrote, the kind of smile that made him want to turn away, because there was no joy in it, only a terrible kind of surrender. She was buried in consecrated ground, but her children left the village before the next Samhain came. They understood what the Druids had always taught. Love doesn't die with the body. It transforms. And sometimes that transformation is beautiful, a gentle presence watching over the living, offering comfort from beyond. But sometimes, when death is sudden or the bond between souls is too strong, love becomes something else. It becomes need. It becomes hunger. It becomes a force that will tear through the boundaries between worlds to claim what it believes still belongs to it. This is what the Church never understood when they tried to baptize Samhain into Christian tradition. They saw pagan superstition, devil worship, primitive fear of the dark. They missed the profound psychological truth embedded in Celtic wisdom. The dead aren't distant, aren't removed from us by some impossible gulf. They exist in a space so close to our own that on certain nights, under certain conditions, the separation becomes meaningless. And the emotions that bind us in life, love, anger, regret, obsession, don't evaporate with the final breath. They intensify. They concentrate. They become powerful enough to reach back across the divide and touch us in ways that can save us or destroy us. The Celts knew this because they had seen it happen across generations. They had watched strong men reduced to empty shells after encounters with deceased wives who couldn't accept their absence. They had witnessed children waste away after being touched by dead siblings who wanted playmates in their cold underground kingdom. They understood that the dead weren't evil, weren't demons or monsters in the Christian sense. They were simply human souls dealing with the incomprehensible trauma of death, and some dealt with it better than others. Some found peace. Some found purpose in watching over their descendants. And some became so trapped in their grief, their rage, their desperate longing, that they became dangerous in ways no living person could ever be. This led to the most disturbing aspect of Samhain traditions, one that historians rarely discuss and modern Halloween completely ignores. Sometimes the living would make deals with the dead. The practice was called soul bargaining, and it was both forbidden and widely practiced, depending on desperation and circumstance. A farmer whose crops were failing might promise to send his eldest son across the vale in exchange for one more season of abundant harvest. A woman unable to conceive might offer her own life in exchange for a child, betting that she could bear and raise the baby before the debt came due. These weren't metaphorical bargains or symbolic rituals. The Celts believed these were actual contracts, witnessed by the Druids, binding in ways that transcended mortal law. And the dead apparently kept records. They remembered every promise, every offering denied, every word spoken in the darkness when the veil was thin. There are accounts of people being claimed years, even decades, after making such bargains, living their lives normally until one Samhain night when something would call their name and they would walk into the darkness, never to return. Their families would know, would understand that the debt had finally come due, and there was nothing to be done except ensure they fulfilled their own obligations to avoid inheriting the unpaid balance. But here's where the story shifts, where everything we think we understand about Samhain reveals itself to be incomplete. In 1962, an archaeologist named Dr. Sarah Brennan was excavating a Celtic burial site in County Cork, Ireland. She found something that changed academic understanding of these ancient practices. Buried beneath layers of earth and stone, she discovered a chamber that appeared to be a meeting place rather than a tomb. The walls were covered in symbols, some recognizable from Celtic tradition, others completely unknown. But what stunned Dr. Brennan and her team was the evidence they found in the center of the chamber. Offerings. Hundreds of offerings. Food items preserved by the unique soil conditions, jewelry, tools, weapons, all arranged in a specific pattern, and all dating to different time periods spanning over 1,000 years. What this meant was staggering. The offerings weren't just left once and forgotten. This site had been visited, maintained, and restocked regularly for centuries, long after Christianity supposedly replaced Celtic traditions, long after Samhain was supposedly absorbed into Halloween. Someone, or multiple generations of someones, had continued the practice in secret, hiding it from church authorities, preserving the old ways even as the world transformed around them. And when Dr. Brennan published her findings, other archaeologists began looking more carefully at sites they had previously dismissed. They found the same pattern: hidden chambers, continuous offerings, evidence that the feeding of the dead never actually stopped. It went underground, it became secret, but it never died. Even today, in remote parts of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, there are families who maintain traditions they won't discuss with outsiders. They leave offerings on Samhain night, not at their front doors where neighbors might see, but at specific locations in the countryside that have been used for this purpose for longer than anyone can remember. They speak words in old languages that even they don't fully understand, passed down through generations with strict instructions never to change a single syllable. They light fires and perform rituals that look like innocent bonfires to casual observers, but carry meanings that stretch back to pre-Christian times. Why? What could possibly motivate people in the modern world, with all our science and skepticism, to continue practices rooted in ancient superstition? Dr. Brennan spent the last 20 years of her career interviewing these families, gaining their trust, documenting their stories. And what she found was both simple and terrifying. It worked, whatever mechanism the ancient Celts had discovered for interacting with death and the dead, it produced results. Families who maintained the traditions reported fewer unexplained deaths, fewer instances of mental illness, fewer accidents and tragedies than statistical probability would predict. Those who stopped, who decided they were too educated or modern for such nonsense, often experienced dramatic reversals. Sudden deaths, runs of catastrophic bad luck, events that couldn't be easily explained but were too consistent to ignore. Dr. Brennan remained agnostic about the supernatural explanation. She proposed that perhaps the rituals provided psychological benefits, a way of processing grief and maintaining family cohesion that protected against the mental health issues that often manifest as physical problems. But the families she interviewed laughed at this interpretation. They knew what they knew. The dead were real, the other world was real, and the barriers between had never truly strengthened since Samhain began. They had simply learned to hide their knowledge from a world that no longer believed. And this is where the story turns dark in a new way, because if these families were right, if the old practices still worked, then what does it mean that the modern world has abandoned them? We celebrate Halloween with plastic decorations and candy corn, completely severed from any genuine acknowledgement of death or the dead. We no longer leave real offerings. We no longer perform protective rituals. We've stripped away every layer of spiritual significance and replaced it with commerce and entertainment. And if the ancient Celts were correct about the nature of Samhain, about the hunger of the dead and the thinning of the veil, then what happens when an entire civilization stops feeding what was never meant to go hungry? The statistics began appearing in the late 1990s, scattered across different journals, different disciplines, never quite connecting until someone looked at them all together. Rates of unexplained deaths on October 31st had been slowly, steadily climbing. Not by dramatic amounts, not enough to trigger widespread alarm, but consistent enough that actuaries at insurance companies started noticing. Emergency room admissions spiked every Halloween night, far beyond what could be explained by accidents or alcohol consumption. Mental health crisis hotlines reported their highest call volumes of the year on November 1st, and missing persons reports filed in the week following Halloween outnumbered any other time period by a significant margin. Dr. Brennan saw the pattern. She spent her final years trying to get anyone, to take it seriously. She presented at conferences, published papers, made connections that her academic colleagues found uncomfortable. The abandonment of genuine Samhain practices, she argued, wasn't just a cultural loss. It might be creating a genuine problem. If the Celtic understanding of death and the barrier between worlds had any validity, then modern Halloween represented something unprecedented, a night when the veil still thinned, when the dead still reached across, but when no one was performing the rituals that kept both sides safe, no offerings to acknowledge and appease, no protections to shield the vulnerable, no communal gatherings to provide strength in numbers, just millions of people wandering in the darkness, dressed as ghosts and monsters, completely unaware that they might be inviting something real. She died in 2019, 3 days after Halloween, in her sleep. The medical examiner found no cause of death. Her heart simply stopped, her body showing no signs of disease or trauma. She was 73, not young but not old enough for her death to be expected. Her research notes, thousands of pages documenting hidden practices and family testimonies, disappeared from her office before her estate could be settled. The university claimed they had no record of them. Her backup files, stored on multiple hard drives, were all corrupted beyond recovery. It was as if something wanted her work erased, her warnings silenced. But whispers continued. Online forums dedicated to folklore and ancient practices began filling with stories. Modern stories. A college student in Massachusetts who went to a Halloween party dressed as a plague doctor and came home to find his apartment filled with the smell of death. A smell that wouldn't dissipate no matter how many times he cleaned or how long he left windows open. He moved out within a week. The smell, he claimed, followed him. A family in Oregon who bought an old Victorian house and threw an elaborate Halloween party, decorating with cemetery aesthetics and joking about raising the dead. That night, their infant daughter stopped breathing 3 separate times, each time reviving just before paramedics arrived. They sold the house. They don't celebrate Halloween anymore. A woman in New Orleans reported waking at 3 in the morning on November 1st to find wet footprints leading from her front door to her bedroom, though she lived alone on the 2nd floor and it hadn't rained. The footprints, she said, were the exact size and shape of her grandmother's feet, and her grandmother had drowned 5 years earlier. An entire neighborhood in Vermont experienced simultaneous power outages on Halloween night, but only the houses that had been decorated. The houses that remained dark and unadorned never lost electricity. Coincidence, the utility company said. They couldn't explain the pattern? These stories multiplied, shared in spaces where people still believed in things beyond scientific explanation. And certain patterns emerged from the collective testimony. The phenomena intensified in areas where Celtic populations had historically settled. They seemed to target people who treated Halloween as purely entertainment, who mocked or commercialized death without respect. And they happened most frequently to those who had recently lost someone, as if grief created a beacon that drew attention from the other side. The families who maintained the old practices, the ones Dr. Brennan had studied, watched all this with grim recognition. They had warned about this for generations. When you stop feeding the hungry, hunger doesn't disappear. It grows. When you stop acknowledging the dead, they don't politely fade away. They become angry. When you remove all sacred significance from a night that was never meant to be trivial, you don't eliminate the danger. You simply remove the defenses. Some of these families began reaching out, trying to share their knowledge with anyone who would listen. They created websites that looked like historical education resources but contained actual instructions for protective rituals. They published books framed as folklore collections that were actually manuals for Samhain safety. They offered workshops disguised as cultural heritage classes, teaching people how to leave proper offerings, how to create genuine protective wards, how to recognize when something from the other side was taking an unhealthy interest in them. The response was mostly mockery. Modern pagans accused them of cultural appropriation or making up traditions. Skeptics dismissed them as charlatans profiting from superstition. Christians condemned them as devil worshippers. The families shrugged and continued their work. They weren't trying to convert anyone or prove anything. They were simply trying to prevent what they knew was coming, what their ancestors had warned would eventually happen if the knowledge was lost completely. Because there's a threshold. The Druids understood this, encoded it in their oral traditions. The dead can be patient, can wait years, decades, even centuries for what they're owed. But there comes a point where patience transforms into something else, where the collective hunger of thousands of years of unacknowledged dead reaches a critical mass, where the barrier between worlds doesn't just thin on Samhain night but begins to crack, to fragment, to fail in ways that can't be repaired by simply resuming old practices. The Druids called this the breaking, and it was their deepest fear, the apocalyptic scenario they built their entire spiritual infrastructure to prevent. What would the breaking look like? The fragments of prophecy that survived suggest a gradual collapse rather than a sudden catastrophe. The dead would begin appearing more frequently, not just on Samhain but throughout the year. The distinction between the living and the dead would blur, with people unable to tell which category they belonged to. Time would become unreliable, with individuals experiencing personal chronologies that didn't match the calendar, aging years and days or remaining frozen while the world moved forward without them. The other world would begin bleeding into physical reality, creating spaces where normal rules didn't apply, where people could walk into an ordinary room and never find their way out, or where they would encounter things that shouldn't exist in the living world. And it would start small, barely noticeable, easy to dismiss as coincidence or mass hysteria, until it wasn't, until the incidents became too frequent, too consistent, too impossible to explain away, until everyone knew someone who had vanished, someone who had changed, someone who claimed to have seen things that made them question everything they thought they understood about life and death. Some of the families believe the breaking has already begun. They point to the rising statistics, the increasing reports, the sense that something fundamental has shifted in the world since the turn of the millennium. Others argue there's still time, that enough people are unknowingly performing protective acts, that the collective unconscious still remembers even if the conscious mind has forgotten. They point to people who light candles for deceased loved ones without knowing why, who feel compelled to leave flowers at graves on specific dates, who avoid certain places on Halloween night because something just feels wrong. But time is running out. Each year that passes with Halloween celebrated as pure entertainment, with millions of people treating death as a costume and the veil as a party theme, pushes closer to the threshold. Each generation that grows up completely severed from the original practices loses more of the instinctive knowledge that once protected humanity. And the dead, patient as they may be, are not infinite in their restraint. They remember when they were honored, feared, acknowledged as real. They remember when offerings were genuine and abundant. They remember when the living understood that death was not an ending but a transition, and that those who transitioned still had needs, still had power, still had connections to the world they left behind. And they are waiting, not passively, but actively, gathering strength, testing boundaries, learning the weak points in our modern defenses, discovering that a world that doesn't believe in them is a world that can't protect itself from them. The question is no longer whether something will happen, the question is no longer whether the ancient Celts were right to fear Samhain, but whether we've forgotten how to survive it. The question that matters now, the question that should make everyone pause as they blow out their jack-o'-lantern candles and store away their decorations, is this: what happens on the night when the dead decide they've waited long enough? The answer came on Halloween night 2023 in a way that most people missed because they weren't looking for it. In the small Irish village of Bellicroy, population 412, something extraordinary happened. The event was reported in local papers as a gas leak causing mass hallucinations. But the people who were there know differently. They don't talk about it much, especially not to outsiders, but if you ask the right questions, if you show enough respect, some will tell you what actually occurred. The village had maintained its Samhain traditions unbroken for over 1,500 years. Every family participated. Everyone knew the prayers, performed the rituals, left the offerings exactly as their ancestors had done. But that year, a developer from Dublin had purchased land on the outskirts of town. He planned to build a resort, something modern and profitable, and he needed to clear some of the old stones to make room for his construction. The village protested. Those stones, they explained, marked boundaries, sacred boundaries. Remove them, and you remove protections that had stood for longer than Christianity itself. The developer laughed. Superstitious nonsense, he called it. The law was on his side. The stones came down in September. Halloween arrived with unusual weather. Fog rolled in from the sea, thicker than anyone could remember, so dense that people walking the village streets couldn't see their own hands in front of their faces. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour, and then the sounds began. Voices speaking in Old Irish, a language no one in the village actually spoke, but that some recognized from academic study. Footsteps on cobblestones. Knocking on doors. The scrape of something heavy being dragged through the streets. The villagers did exactly what their traditions demanded. They gathered in the community hall, every single person, even the developer who had suddenly lost his skepticism. They lit the bonfire in the old way, using wood from sacred trees kept for exactly this purpose. They laid out offerings, not token amounts, but genuine sacrifice, the best food they had, items of real value, and they waited. For 3 hours they waited while something moved through the village outside. They heard windows breaking, doors being forced open. The sounds of furniture overturning, of searching, of hunger that had grown too strong to be denied. Then silence. Complete, absolute silence that pressed against their ears like physical weight. And in that silence, every person in the hall saw something different, but also the same. They saw the dead. Not as ghosts or transparent apparitions, but as solid and real as they had been in life. Grandparents who died decades ago, children lost to disease, warriors killed in ancient battles, people in clothing from eras spanning back to prehistory. The hall was suddenly crowded with hundreds, thousands of figures, all watching the living with expressions that mixed longing, anger, sadness, and something deeper that had no name in modern languages. An elderly woman named Chalban, the village's keeper of traditions, stood and spoke. She didn't plan what to say. The words came from somewhere older than conscious thought. She acknowledged them, each one. She spoke their names when she knew them, and for those she didn't, she acknowledged their presence, their sacrifice, their long patience. She explained what had happened, that the boundary stones had been removed, that the modern world had made a mistake, that the village would restore them and make amends. She promised, with the full weight of her community behind her, that the offerings would continue, that the traditions would be maintained, that they would teach their children and their children's children to remember. And the dead responded, not with words, but with a feeling that swept through every living person in that hall. It was grief, overwhelming grief, not at their own deaths, but at being forgotten, at being reduced to entertainment, at watching the world they loved and sacrificed for treat their memory as decoration, as costume, as commercial opportunity. They didn't want revenge. They wanted acknowledgement. They wanted to matter. They wanted the living to understand that death doesn't erase love or connection or the fundamental reality of having existed. One by one, the dead faded, not vanishing, but stepping back, returning to wherever they existed now that they no longer walked in flesh. As they faded, each living person in that hall felt something settle into them, a knowledge that bypassed language and logic. They understood, in a way that could never be explained but only experienced, why the old practices existed. Not to appease cruel entities or avoid supernatural punishment, but to maintain a bridge, to ensure that the living never became so disconnected from death that they lost sight of their own humanity. Because to forget the dead is to forget that we will all eventually join them. To trivialize death is to trivialize life. To treat the barrier between worlds as meaningless is to lose respect for the profound weight of existence itself. The fog lifted at dawn. The developer left town and never returned. The village restored the boundary stones, and this time they added legal protections that would prevent their removal regardless of development plans. And word spread, quietly, through the networks of families who still maintained the old knowledge. Something had shifted. The dead had made their point, had shown just enough of their reality to serve as warning and reminder both. The breaking hadn't occurred, but it had come close. Close enough to feel its breath, to see its shadow, to understand what would be lost if the threshold was actually crossed. Since then, there's been a change, subtle but growing. More families asking questions about real traditions. More people seeking out the knowledge that Dr. Brennan tried to preserve. More individuals who celebrate Halloween but then, privately, perform small rituals that their rational minds tell them are silly but something deeper insists are necessary. Candles lit for specific deceased loved ones. Food left at graves. Moments of genuine acknowledgement that death is real, that those who died still matter, that the connection between living and dead isn't severed by a heartbeat stopping. The statistics have stabilized. Haven't improved dramatically, but stopped their upward climb. Emergency rooms on Halloween night are still busy, but not increasingly so. The missing persons reports leveled off. It's not proof of anything, not in a scientific sense, but those who understand the old ways recognize it for what it is. A reprieve. A temporary step back from the edge. The dead showed mercy, showed that they could devastate but chose restraint, chose to give humanity another chance to remember, to honor, to maintain the practices that keep both worlds in balance. But it's not over. It's never over. Every Halloween, the choice is made again. Every generation must decide whether to maintain the knowledge or let it slip further away. The modern world continues its march toward complete skepticism, toward treating everything as commodity or entertainment. And the dead continue their patient vigil, waiting to see if the living will remember in time or if another reminder will be necessary. A stronger one, a final one. The families who know, who maintain the traditions, they continue their work. They teach anyone who will listen. They perform their rituals regardless of mockery or disbelief. They leave their offerings knowing that most people will never understand why, because they've seen what happens when the offerings stop. They've felt the presence of the dead when the veil grows thin. They know, in their bones and blood and the deep ancestral memory that resides in every human regardless of heritage, that some truths can't be proven but must be honored anyway. And perhaps that's the real revelation, the actual climax of this ancient story that continues to unfold every October 31st. It's not about whether the dead are literally real in a physical sense. It's about whether we have the humility to acknowledge that we don't understand everything, that death remains the great mystery, and that respect for that mystery matters. The Celts weren't primitive or superstitious. They were sophisticated enough to recognize that some things transcend rational explanation while still demanding serious attention. So when you carve your pumpkin this year, when you dress in your costume, when you hand out candy to children or attend parties themed around death and darkness, pause for just a moment. Think about what this night originally meant. Consider the possibility that the barrier between life and death might actually thin on this specific night for reasons we've forgotten how to articulate, and maybe, just maybe, leave an offering. Not candy, something real. Something that acknowledges that death is part of life, that those who died deserve remembrance, that the ancient wisdom was earned through experience we should respect rather than dismiss. Because the question isn't whether the dead will come for us, they will. Death comes for everyone. The question is whether, when we cross that barrier ourselves, we'll find a world that remembers us, that honors us, that maintains the connection between what was and what is. The question is whether we'll join the patient dead who wait for acknowledgement, or the angry dead who waited too long and finally demanded it. The morning after Halloween 2025 arrives quietly. The streets are littered with candy wrappers and deflated decorations. Carved pumpkins sit on porches, their candles long extinguished, their faces already beginning to collapse inward as the flesh softens and decays. Children wake late, their pillowcases still full of chocolate bars and gummy treats, spoils from the night of walking door to door in costumes that will be forgotten by next year. Parents sip coffee and scroll through photos, already planning next year's decorations, already thinking about how to make it bigger, more elaborate, more Instagram-worthy. And somewhere, in places most people will never see, families perform a different kind of mourning ritual. They collect the offerings they left the night before, the real food that no trick-or-treater touched, the items of value placed at crossroads and burial sites. Some offerings are gone, taken by animals or homeless wanderers, or perhaps by something else entirely. It doesn't matter. What matters is that they were given. What matters is the act of remembering, of acknowledging, of maintaining a tradition that stretches back further than written history. These families understand something that the modern world has worked hard to forget. Death is not the opposite of life, but a part of it. The dead are not gone, but transformed. And the relationship between the living and the dead requires maintenance, attention, respect, just like any relationship worth preserving. This is what Samhain was always about, beneath the layers of mythology and ritual and supernatural belief. It was about refusing to let death create absolute separation. It was about insisting that those who came before still matter, still deserve acknowledgement, still hold a place in the circle of family and community even after their physical presence has ended. The candy your children collected last night, the treats that filled their bags and buckets, those were never meant for them at all. They're a diluted echo, a commercial replacement for something far more profound. The ancient Celts would have looked at our Halloween with confusion and perhaps pity. They would see a night that still retains its timing, its association with death and darkness, its acknowledgement that something changes when October becomes November. But they would see a people who have forgotten why any of it matters, who perform the rituals without understanding their purpose, who dress as the dead without honoring them, who celebrate darkness without respecting its power. And yet, perhaps that forgetting was necessary. Perhaps the modern mind, trained in skepticism and scientific method, needed to distance itself from the raw terror and supernatural belief that governed ancient lives. Perhaps we needed to make Halloween safe, commercialized, child-friendly, in order to survive in a world where belief in the literal reality of spirits and other worlds would be seen as mental illness rather than spiritual awareness. The ancient Celts lived with constant awareness of death, constant proximity to violence and disease, and the fragility of existence. We have the luxury of treating death as distant, as something that happens to other people, as a problem to be solved rather than a reality to be integrated. But luxury comes with a cost. When we lost the fear, we also lost the respect. When we stopped believing in the literal power of the dead, we also stopped honoring their memory with any real weight. When Halloween became a holiday for children and parties, It ceased to be a night when adults confronted the most fundamental truth of human existence, that we are all temporary, that everyone we love will eventually die, that we ourselves will cross the barrier we spend so much energy pretending doesn't apply to us. The question from the beginning, the question about who the candy was really meant for, has a complicated answer. In the strictest historical sense, yes, the offerings were for the dead, for spirits, for entities that existed in the liminal space between worlds, but in a deeper sense, they were for the living. They were a forced meditation on mortality, a required acknowledgement that death is real and must be faced rather than ignored. A community practice that ensured no one could pretend, even for a day, that they would live forever or that their loved ones existed permanently. Modern psychology has discovered what the ancient Celts knew instinctively. Avoiding death, refusing to think about it or plan for it or integrate it into our understanding of life, creates anxiety, depression, a sense of meaninglessness. But confronting death, accepting it as a natural part of existence, discussing it openly, and maintaining relationships with the deceased through memory and ritual, these practices correlate with better mental health, stronger family bonds, and deeper sense of purpose. The ancient practices weren't superstitious nonsense. They were sophisticated psychological and social technology disguised as supernatural belief. So, what do we do with this knowledge? We can't turn back the clock, can't force modern society to adopt Celtic practices wholesale. Most people will continue celebrating Halloween exactly as they have been, with costumes and parties and candy, blissfully unaware of the traditions they're unconsciously echoing. And perhaps that's fine. Perhaps the important thing isn't that everyone believes in literal spirits and other worlds, but that the framework exists for those who need it, for those who feel the truth of it in ways that transcend rational explanation. If you feel drawn to leave real offerings on Halloween night, to light candles for deceased loved ones, to spend time in contemplation of mortality and memory, then do it. You don't need permission. You don't need to believe in Celtic mythology or accept supernatural explanations. You simply need to recognize that some part of you, some ancient part that exists beneath conditioning and education and modern skepticism, knows that death deserves acknowledgement and the dead deserve remembrance. And if you don't feel drawn to these practices, if Halloween remains for you a secular holiday about costumes and candy and autumn fun, that's equally valid. The dead don't require belief. They simply are or exist in whatever form consciousness takes after the body stops functioning. Your belief or disbelief changes nothing about the reality of death itself. But consider this. Every tradition we practice today, every holiday we celebrate, every ritual we perform began because someone somewhere was trying to solve a problem or express a truth that mattered deeply to them. Halloween began as Samhain because the Celts needed a way to face death without being destroyed by the fear of it. They needed to believe they could maintain relationships with the deceased, that death didn't mean absolute ending, that love and memory could bridge the gap between worlds. Whether or not their supernatural explanations were literally true, the need they were addressing was absolutely real. We still have that need. We still struggle with death, still grieve those we've lost, still wonder what, if anything, happens after the final breath. We still want to believe that our deceased loved ones are somehow aware of us, watching over us, existing somewhere even if we can't see or touch them anymore. Halloween, even in its modern commercialized form, provides a space for that need. A night when we can dress as the dead, tell ghost stories, light candles and carved pumpkins, and briefly pretend that the barrier between living and dead is permeable. The ancient Celts weren't more superstitious than we are. They were simply more honest about their needs and fears. They created rituals that addressed those needs directly rather than hiding them beneath layers of commercial distraction. And perhaps the real lesson of Samhain, the real wisdom that echoes across 2,000 years, is that death should be acknowledged, that the dead should be honored, and that both practices are essential for the living to find peace. Tonight, as you pass houses still displaying wilting jack-o'-lanterns, As you step over scattered candy wrappers, as you return to the normal rhythm of life after the strange interlude of Halloween, remember what this night once meant. Remember that your ancestors, regardless of heritage, had practices for honoring the dead and confronting mortality. Remember that death is not a distant problem, but a present reality that shapes every moment of life. And remember that those who came before you, who loved and suffered and eventually died so that you could exist, they deserve more than a glance at old photos or a vague sense of guilt about not visiting graves often enough. They deserve to be remembered, truly remembered. Spoken to, even if only in the silence of your own mind. Acknowledged as real people who had real lives and whose absence leaves real holes in the world. The Celts understood this. The offerings were never about supernatural transaction. They were about refusing to forget. They were about insisting that death does not erase the importance of having lived. So the question isn't really about candy or ancient spirits or whether Samhain traditions should be revived. The question is simpler and far more personal. When you die, when you cross that threshold that terrified and fascinated the ancient Celts, who will remember you? Who will speak your name? Who will leave offerings at the altar of your memory? And while you're still alive, while you still walk in flesh and breath, whose names are you speaking? Whose memory are you honoring? Whose existence are you refusing to let death erase? The dead walked free on Samhain night, not because the barrier disappeared, but because the living refused to lock them away in silence and forgetting. Perhaps that's the only magic that was ever real, the power of memory, the power of acknowledgement, the power of love that insists death is not the final word. And maybe that's enough.